She walked into Washington carrying the most ambitious European proposal in a generation, months of preparation, dozens of compromises that European leaders had never previously agreed to make, a document her own team believed was bulletproof. She walked out with nothing, not a counteroffer, not a maybe, not even the basic diplomatic courtesy of a scheduled follow-up, just a closed door and a single document placed on the table by Trump's team that made the entire room go silent. Because that document did not argue back. It did not negotiate. It presented a number, and that number represented something European governments have spent decades pretending did not exist: the bill. The actual itemized, fiscally precise bill for 70 years of American protection that Europe accepted, depended on, and never fully paid for. The post-war world order did not collapse today with a war or a crisis or a market crash. It collapsed in a quiet room in Washington when one side finally decided to stop pretending the arrangement was equal, and Europe has 7 days to decide what it does next. 7 days, and it is already falling apart. The meeting was never supposed to leak. That is the first thing to understand. What happened inside that room was designed to stay inside that room long enough for both sides to manage the narrative, to control the sequence of revelations, to decide what the public learned and in what order. It leaked anyway, and what came out has done something that years of political tension and trade disputes and NATO funding arguments never quite managed to do. It has forced a genuine reckoning with the question that sits at the foundation of everything Europe has built since 1945. What is the transatlantic alliance actually worth? Who has been paying for it? And what happens the moment the larger party decides the arrangement no longer suits them? Ursula von der Leyen arrived in Washington with a document her team had spent months constructing. They called it internally Agenda 2026, and the name was deliberate. It was meant to signal forward momentum, partnership, a shared vision extending beyond the immediate friction of tariff disputes and defense spending arguments into something more durable and more strategically coherent. The document ran to 47 pages. It contained trade concessions that European member states had resisted for years. It contained revised commitments on defense spending, structured specifically to address the complaints that Washington had been making loudly and repeatedly about European free-riding on American military investment. It contained a new framework for Ukraine funding designed to distribute the financial burden in ways that American domestic politics could more comfortably absorb. Her team believed they had built something that gave Trump everything he had asked for publicly, while preserving enough European institutional dignity that the deal could be sold at home without triggering a political collapse. They had spent months stress testing it. They had war-gamed the likely American responses. They believed they had closed every exit. They had not closed the one that mattered. Trump's team reviewed the document for less than 20 minutes. The response they sent back was not a counteroffer. It was not a list of amendments or a request for clarification on specific points or an invitation to continue the conversation at a lower diplomatic level while the principals took time to consider. It was a single document with a name that landed in the European delegation like a physical blow: the ledger of debt. This was not metaphor, and it was not theater. According to sources with direct knowledge of what passed between the two delegations, the Ledger of Debt is a genuine document prepared by Trump's economic advisory team over a period of several weeks before the meeting. It is organized by fiscal year. It is broken into itemized categories. It covers trade imbalances, defense burden differentials, intelligence infrastructure costs, and logistical support expenses associated with NATO operations that European member states have benefited from across decades without contributing to proportionally. The total figures it contains are not the kind of numbers that can be dismissed as political exaggeration or ideological posturing. They are the kind of numbers that land with weight precisely because everyone in the room already knows they are in the right territory. Over the previous fiscal year alone, the United States absorbed a trade deficit, with the Eurozone exceeding $350 billion. That figure does not include the $80 billion in retroactive defense burden contributions that Trump's team formally placed on the table as a demand. It does not include the calculated cost of American intelligence infrastructure that has protected European capitals from threats their own domestic agencies were never resourced to address independently. When the European delegation saw those numbers laid out in that sequence with that level of specificity, the room went quiet. Not the quiet of disagreement, the quiet of recognition. Because the dirty secret sitting at the center of the transatlantic relationship, the fact that European governments have managed with extraordinary collective discipline never to say plainly in public, is that the alliance was never genuinely equal. It was always structured around an unspoken subsidy. America supplied the military credibility, the strategic umbrella, the logistical backbone, and the intelligence architecture. Europe supplied the markets, the political cooperation, and the appearance of a unified Western civilization presenting a coherent face to the world. It was a workable arrangement for as long as both sides found it useful, and neither side insisted on putting precise numbers on what each was actually contributing. Trump had just put precise numbers on it. He had taken the unspoken subsidy, assigned it a dollar value, printed it in a document, and placed it on a table in Washington for European officials to sit across from and confront directly. The response in Brussels when the details of the meeting began to filter through was not measured deliberation. It was the kind of immediate and poorly concealed alarm that breaks through institutional composure when an organization suddenly understands that the ground it has been standing on is not the ground it thought it was standing on. Emergency calls connected Paris and Berlin within hours. Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz spoke on a secure line, and the tone of that conversation, according to those familiar with its content, was not the tone of leaders managing a predictable crisis with established tools. It was the tone of leaders confronting a situation for which their existing frameworks had not prepared them. Macron was pushing for an emergency European defense summit, a rapid and visible demonstration that Europe could project strategic independence without American backing. Scholz was considerably less certain that such a demonstration was achievable in the time frame the situation demanded, and he had reasons for that uncertainty that went beyond political caution. Because the military reality underneath the diplomatic language is something that no European leader has been willing to state publicly with full honesty, and it is a reality that Trump's team understands in precise operational detail. Without American satellite intelligence, without American command and control infrastructure, without American logistical networks, the combined military capacity of the European Union cannot sustain a credible defense of its eastern flank against a serious and prolonged threat. The numbers make this plain. The United States currently directs approximately 3.5% of its GDP toward defense. Germany, the nation that carries the largest economy in Europe and therefore bears the greatest expectation of leading any serious independent European military posture, crossed the 2% NATO threshold only recently, and only after years of sustained American pressure that Berlin resisted for as long as it politically could. Spain and Italy remain meaningfully below that line. The gap between what Europe spends on its own defense and what genuine strategic independence would actually require is not a gap that an emergency summit can close. It is a gap that represents decades of underinvestment and a generation of political choices made on the assumption that the American umbrella would always be there and would never come with a bill attached. That assumption has just been retired, and the 7 days that follow are going to reveal whether Europe has anything real to replace it with. The fracture did not announce itself. That is how structural failures work when they are serious. They do not arrive with sirens and warning lights. They arrive as a slight change in temperature, a quiet phone call, an absence where presence was expected, a statement carefully worded to mean two things simultaneously depending on who is reading it and what they need it to say. The fracture in European unity arrived exactly that way, and by the time Brussels fully understood what it was looking at, the crack had already run further through the wall than anyone in von der Leyen's inner circle was prepared to publicly acknowledge. Italy moved first. That is the detail that reshapes everything else in this story, because Italy is not a peripheral member of the European project that can defect from a unified position without serious consequence. Italy is the third largest economy in the Eurozone. Its manufacturing output, its tourism revenues, its luxury goods sector, its agricultural export infrastructure are all woven deeply into the fabric of both European economic integration and American consumer demand. When Italy stands with Brussels, the European position has genuine weight. When Italy quietly steps away from Brussels and picks up a separate phone line to Washington, the European position becomes something that can be photographed from the outside but cannot bear load from within. According to sources inside the Italian Foreign Ministry, Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni communicated to her closest advisors before the Brussels Emergency Summit had even concluded that Italy would not be joining any coordinated retaliatory measures against the United States. No counter-tariffs, no World Trade Organization challenge, no collective economic response of any kind that placed Rome in direct confrontation with Washington. While von der Leyen was standing in front of cameras projecting the image of a unified European front, Meloni was on a separate secure line, and the person on the other end of that line was not Macron. The reasoning behind Meloni's decision is not the reasoning of a leader who has lost her nerve or abandoned her principles under pressure. It is the reasoning of a leader who has looked at her country's actual financial position with clear eyes and reached a conclusion that the arithmetic makes very difficult to argue with. Italy carries the heaviest public debt burden in the Eurozone relative to the size of its economy. Its sovereign bond market operates permanently close to the boundary between stability and the kind of confidence crisis that Brussels would find extremely difficult to contain if it crossed over. The last thing a government managing that level of financial exposure can afford is a sustained trade confrontation with the world's largest economy that drives American institutional investors out of Italian sovereign debt at a moment when those investors represent a critical source of the confidence that keeps Italian borrowing costs